to the responsibility to protect.
Atrocity prevention.
Words kill.
All societies are potentially vulnerable.
Atrocity crimes.
Timely and appropriate action.
Welcome to Expert Voices on Atrocity Prevention by the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. I'm Jacqueline Streitfeld Hall, Deputy Executive Director at the Global Center. This podcast features one-on-one conversations with practitioners from the fields of human rights, conflict prevention, and atrocity prevention. These conversations will give us a glimpse of the personal and professional side of how practitioners approach human rights protection and atrocity prevention, allowing us to explore challenges, identify best practices, and share lessons learned on how we can protect populations more effectively. Today I'm speaking with Daniel Akech, Senior Analyst on South Sudan for the International Crisis Group. Thank you for joining us today, Daniel.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
To start us off, Daniel, could you tell us a bit about your journey to becoming Crisis Group's Senior South Sudan Analyst and what your work there involves?
In the past, I was a refugee coming from the then southern Sudan regions of Sudan. It was war torn. I stayed in a refugee camp in Kenya for a couple of years, and then I went to the U.S. I stayed there, went to school, studied for my bachelor's degree and a master's and a doctorate, and I even work in the U.S. But South Sudan became independent in 2011, and I started to work with refugee students returning back from California to work with refugees in Kenya, South Sudanese refugees in Kenya, as well as from Nuba Mountains in Sudan. And while I was doing this work, there was kind of sort of violence reoccurring, and then many people could not actually go back even after independence, and that actually got me interested in trying to study South Sudan as a sort of like a side thing. It was just like an interest, and then the conflicts broke out in South Sudan in 2013. I got involved in a. I was there when it happened, so I did not actually go back to the U.S. I could have gone back to the U.S., but I stayed and ended up actually writing a book about this sort of like surprising shock that is a sort of like independent of South Sudan was supported by the U.S. Everybody in the world was so happy for the South Sudanese to attain their independence, and then while 2 years later it was just like a mess. So I stayed and wrote about it, and that actually gave me a sort of like a second job where a skills set that I could use. And 2 years ago, I decided to apply for a job at the crisis group here in Nairobi, and I was lucky I got the job. So I moved over to Nairobi. So I've been here for the last 2 years. What I do for crisis groups is basically a continuation of what I was doing for writing on conflict dynamics in South Sudan. Basically, crisis group is all about conflicts preventions and mitigations. And so, what I have been writing about is basically looking at the public authority and how it affects people, especially the governed. And that's basically what I do here is just giving some warnings, studying conflicts, explaining the dynamics, and basically giving some forecast on where things could be in the coming months, and then talking with policy makers in the regions on ways to mitigate upcoming violence, how to actually address the violence that are already happening to be able to prevent them. So that's really the kind of work I do here at Crisis Group. Yeah.
Great. And, as you noted, after independence, everyone was very happy about the future of South Sudan, and conflict broke out shortly after in 2013. How would you characterize the current trajectory of South Sudan? Is the country experiencing a temporary escalation of violence, or are we witnessing the collapse of the political settlement established under the 2018 peace agreement? And as President Salva Kiir has consolidated power while First Vice President Riek Machar has been politically and even physically marginalized, has the agreement effectively ceased to function as a power sharing arrangement?
Thanks is a really difficult question. First thing is the agreement is actually breaking down badly, and this is a deliberate design. This agreement, when it was signed in 2018, it took almost 2 years for it to actually be implemented. and then it brought a broader coalitions of all the parties that were viewed as sort of like having differences with Juba together into a coalition government, became a very bloated government. What those elites actually did, they managed not to go back to war right away, but they did not actually work for the interest of implementing the agreements. The agreement was based on three key pillars. One was the forces that fragmented when the war broke out in 2013 had to be actually reunified, so that at least if it was going to be a functioning state, you should have one army. That's really the normal practice everywhere else in the world. So the forces that is splintered, they call themselves different names. The parties were supposed to work together to have a consolidated, unified army. Uh, and then the second one was to create a legal basis for the country, the law of the land. In many countries, there is a constitution. The constitution in South Sudan, which was created in 2011, is still considered a transitional constitution. And it had been sort of like misused and it did not work out very well. So the oppositions are viewing it as sort of like it has allowed the president of South Sudan to sort of like become an autocrat because of that constitution. So they wanted change. So what they agreed in that agreement was to make the constitution and the agreement together the law for a short time. So that is really the ambiguity of the legal framework in the country. And the third one was to renew the voter registrations, to create, to look at the census. Many people had been born since 2005, and those people were not part of the democratic exercise in 2010 because they were only 5-year-olds. So now these are already in their 20s, and this is the bulk in many countries that are facing violence in Africa. Majority of people are always the youth. 20 something years old, 15, 50, teenagers. So these people need to actually participate in the democratic process of their country. So that requires renewal of these census as well as the voter registrations. None of those had been actually implemented. So the agreement was failing, but then now there has been an escalation. The ceasefire of the agreement started breaking down mid last year with an incident in Nasser where a general was killed, and then it led to opposition leaders, official, about 7 of them, had been actually put under house arrest, including the main opposition leader who was supposed to work with the president to implement the agreement. So South Sudan had been back at civil war. That's one big problem. In addition to failing to implement the key provision of that agreement, we are now actually facing a war. And then there are also violations regarding the power sharings, where the opposition were supposed to hold some position at the state level and at the national level. Those have been sort of like scrapped away. And that is also, it means the whole agreement is actually failing. But what is more critical is not just the agreement itself, is the design of the state in South Sudan. The state, some people in the international community thinks that the state lacks capacity. There is no capacity. That's why the capacity building is actually not making progress. That's not really the case. The case is that the design of the state was actually intended. South Sudan is functioning in the way the architects intended it to function. That they actually took the liberation's credentials and transformed those into sort of like mechanisms for elite extractions. And so that group that is ruling there is not seeing a failure. Only the outsiders and the citizens are seeing a failure, but they are actually basically seeing something that was designed for their benefit, for their survival, not for public services. So that is really public service provisions had been actually assigned to the outsiders, the UN agencies, other humanitarian organizations had been the one providing education, basic education to children that are displaced. Especially the US was actually handling much of the how do you actually retain kids who had been pushed away from their homes in schools, and then the healthcare, basic healthcare. South Sudan government never had much budget going into those services. So that means the state had been designed basically to fail. So this is the state is being unmet. It's not really being built. So we are not seeing the sort of like state building. we are seeing state deconstruction. So they are basically deconstructing or bringing down the state building architecture. So state institutions have not been built. So this is actually, even if the peace agreement, which is expiring in February next year, and the parties are supposed to sit down now in September to make a decision on whether they will actually dissolve the government and go for elections, or they actually could extend the agreement. It had been extended 4 times so far. So if they were to do the fifth extensions, they cannot do that without Machar case being resolved. And so that's a problem. If they want to go for elections, you cannot have an elections when you are running against yourself. So it's really nobody on the other side. When Machar is out, the others are out. So it's like you go for elections, it's a problem. You don't go for election, it's a problem. So South Sudan has now reached an absolute dead end. So it's not really something that the elites in Juba might sit down and resolve it. Maybe it could involve the rest of the South Sudanese to kind of really think hard about where is the country going. It's not the agreement is dying. That's obvious. Elections or no election doesn't change the trajectory of the violence. We might even see more violence actually in the coming months as a result of elections or an attempt by some people to try to extend that agreement, which would be seen as an sort of like a hollow extension of the agreements. So that is really the state of the play in the country as we speak now, that there's not much of a hope being painted in what I just said, but that's really where South Sudan seems to be going. It's sort of like an absolute dead end where there's not much to be seen beyond that.
That's really helpful. And I want to ask a little bit more about the elections and pick up on what you just said about how it could be. I think elections themselves could be a source of instability, especially if they're not seen as, free and fair and credible. But as you said, if they don't have elections, it could be a source of instability. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that a little. Like, how do you think, the risks could evolve in the coming months? And if they were to proceed with elections, what atrocity risks should the international community prepare for around that?
Yeah, thank you, Jacqueline. This is a really very difficult questions, and I'll try my best to see ways to actually answer both ways. So, if there are arguments now, first thing, election is dividing even the continent. It's not just a South Sudanese issue, because Africans and the whole world are asking these routine elections that we have been seeing throughout in the regions. What do they mean? What do they mean for the average person? So election is supposed to be a democratic exercise that actually should help to stabilize, to get the country out of this cycle of violence and and corruptions that is basically eating everything that should have been used to develop human capital as well as the infrastructure. So if elections are not going to address that, then people have to have a meaning if they want to go to the polls. There are countries in this continent that go to the polls every 5 years consistently for a very long time and never really means anything for the people. So the debates that the South Sudanese are having now, and also the experts, the analysts that are looking into South Sudan, are one group is saying if we don't have elections, we will actually continue with these stagnant transitions that is going nowhere, which is bad. The elites would always just try to push forward with these settlements, the elite-based agreements that are never implemented, and then they are eating everything from the resources. And so now we have seen them dragging on since 2018 up to now, no implementations, nothing. So this state has already produced a war. So their argument is very strong. And the hope behind people pushing for elections is a very important point that they are saying that what if we use election to reset? It's like when you do a rebooting of a computer. This becomes a resetting functions. It's a function that basically resets everything to sort of like nothing, and then we start again. That could create some hope. Now, the other groups that are saying that there is no way you could actually create a war everywhere, 9 out of 10 states are actually facing violence. There are human rights violations everywhere. So if you go to these people that are displaced, they don't have access to food, and these people are thinking that the food, the humanitarian access that could actually help them, is being blocked deliberately by some powerful people. So these people, if you go to them and you talk with them, Jacqueline, telling them, uh, what is your first choice? What do you want to see? It will be food, water, security, safety. It will not be election. Will be the last thing on their list of items that they're demanding. And that's actually is the whole country almost, because look at the displaced people. What do they really want? Are they going to vote here? No. Are they being allowed to actually vote where they are? No. So they actually want security to be able to go home to participate in this. So that is powerful arguments that look, we are not ready for that. We have an active war happening, not just in one locality, but almost everywhere, for which the government is not capable to arrest this insecurity. We have an issue of if you elect a government tomorrow, today, and they sit down tomorrow, which law are they going to use to actually to govern the country? So it's good to at least have some kind of an agreement on what is the common ground legally that should actually allow that new government, envisage elected government, quote unquote, to actually function legally. That you cannot really just operate without laws. So that is also a major issue. So the security issue, the ongoing violence need to actually stop. At the same time, election will be a massive political achievement for South Sudan. It would be like the same way they won their war with the help of everybody in the world who was friendly to them, and then they did an exercise. When they were doing all this major, they did this exercise, referendum exercise that created South Sudan's independence. All of these major things, they had to actually create a political consensus, a political sort of like accommodations. So if you don't have political compromises, you had arrested major political leader, and then you want to go for like the biggest event in the history of the country. That has never happened in the history of South Sudan, where a select group of people would actually undermine, cut out everybody, and they just want to like move on with a big event. This is something that needs a united front across the country. Now, the points which is not nobody is talking about it, for the people who are pushing for elections as sort of like a reset button. The focus, what they want to solve with these elections is the succession crisis, which is basically seen as looming. The president of South Sudan is visibly seen as having some kind of cognitive declines, which is no longer a secret. It's something that the public is actually visible seeing. He's struggling speaking, he's struggling moving around. So these people are aware of this. Now, what if his situations get worse, where he can no longer actually carry on with his functions, with the function of a president? What will happen? Around him, everybody is sort of like working on their own interests. So there is very intense competition within his inner circles. So if he doesn't wake up tomorrow, let's hope it doesn't happen like that, then it will be a chaos. They would actually internally they will fight among each other. So for the people pushing for elections, if there is actually a path for successions, election could provide that. That's a very strong argument, and I respect that. Now the problem is not knowing whether the president will run or not, is who would be the running mate. And that, until today, has not been unveiled. That means the president could actually decide to bring, what if he brings his daughter? Then what kind of what are we legitimizing? What are we subsidizing? It's the same state that has been deliberately going through a backward trajectory that would be actually blessed by the people. So it's sort of like tricking people their desire for elections, because they had never had election exercise. The government seems to be exploiting that to push a completely different agenda, which if people actually realize at the end that the president might be pushing for his family member as the successor, using the people mandates in this manner, it could actually lead to a total chaos. It's not really a question of moral judgment. It's really basically worrying about what are the consequences of having a president sort of like using democratic exercise to trick people to actually elevate a family member into to be the next president of South Sudan. So what this actually is, it does not mean we are judging people or children of the leaders uh, on the basis of the records of their parents, but really what South Sudan's need ultimately is sort of like enforcing financial guardrails, uh, financial accountability. But you cannot have any hope of doing that if you have the same continuity of the same system that has been basically like draining public treasury for a very long time.
Great. I think you've left me in a great position for our next question, which is, you've written extensively about elite politics and patronage in South Sudan. So, turning to the violence and instability right now, to what extent is that driven by local grievances versus competition among national political elites? How much are these two things connected?
The thing is, in South Sudan, it's not one violence that is happening. It's so many different types of violence together, creating like the massive mushrooming of this chaos we are seeing, which when you look at it outside is just a forest, so it looks like a massive black smoke rising up. But once you actually get down into the forest, you see, look at the trees, there are lots of different types of violence happening in South Sudan. The first one is actually the national level violence, which is happening between largely two groups: the president's group and the opposition leader, the main opposition leader. But there are also other small actors, like in Equatoria. South Sudan is divided into three regions: so, Barghazal, Upper Nile, and Equatoria. The president comes from Barghazal, and the main opposition leader, Riek Machar, comes from Upper Nile. And their groups are the respective dominant groups in those two regions. The Dinka ethnic groups, the dominant groups in Barghazal, the Nuer ethnic groups, where the vice president, former vice president Riek Machar comes from, is the dominant groups in Upper Nile. But there are also that other third regions. Equatoria has also grievances, which are led by someone called Thomas Cirillo, whose main primary objective of fighting are calling for a greater autonomy, regional autonomy of his people. So that's a bit different. He's not really calling to take over Juba and take leadership. But the other two leaders are like that. Those three, and then there are much smaller groups that are also involved with them, or the national level. But these people at the national level, this national level violence is not directed by professional forces. The government is not solely using the national army or the national security or the national police, national armed sector. The government is so weakened that they had actually seen dismantling of their own security apparatus. So they are relying on proxy militias. And this is really where the national violence also links to the communities, because these proxy militias, militia groups, are coming from communities at lower level. So they come to the government, sign deals with either the government or the oppositions, and then they are the ones basically fighting each other in Jonglei, in Upper Nile, these proxy militia groups. So once they fight, they're not fighting as national forces. They are fighting wearing two hats. One is the guns are coming from the whoever is supporting them at the national level, but the hat is actually in the hope that they would actually gain these military resources to take them back to go and settle much lower level violence. So at the lower level, there are many issues motivating people to fight. One of them is the land disputes, and which is basically triggered at the national level. The government is creating all these administrative centers with no clear boundaries. So these people are sort of like asserting control over these boundaries, and it's creating lots of issues in Upper Nile. In places like Barghazal, where the government is basically the government, the leadership, and the people are from the same ethnic groups, there's still violence, but of different nature. is a communal violence, which is motivated by economic crimes. Sometimes people call it cattle raiding, and it involves other things. So these are the kind of different violence, and this violence at the lower level, the reason they persist is because the national government is completely powerless. They have lost control over monopoly of violence in the states is actually no longer a question in South Sudan. So this is really where the things is. Now, if you look at the human rights in relation to this violence, if it is actually clearly defined two sides, it's very easy to pick up phone calls and call the president of South Sudan or the main opposition leader. But when you actually outsource the violence to these local people who are faceless, nameless, and you don't even know their interest, they cannot be accountable. But they are committing so much crimes in using all sorts of philosophies. They have ideologies from their local communities where the other community could be, how do you get rid of a neighboring community that is competing with you over the lands? Kill them, finish them. You don't need to actually even have prisoners in this in this manner. What about the civilians? Push them out, push them to a place where they will starve. So that those are affecting how you could address the human rights issues in South Sudan. Because you can go to the president, he might not even know who is fighting where, or the main opposition leader. He had been detained since March last year, and yet his strongholds are actually facing violence. So who is directing all of this? So that is really something that is a bit unique about South Sudan, and this also links up to the structure at the center. South Sudan, sometimes the context, it's very important and it's actually very unique. So when people are looking at South Sudan from sort of like international thinking, we think that we think that somebody is in charge, which is always the case. You show up at somebody's house, is that a mom or dad? If they both are in that house, you would actually look up to them. They are in charge. They are in control. And that's really sort of like a Weberian logic, a Western-based logic, where somebody has to be always in charge. In South Sudan, it might not be the case. It's a completely different system. Maybe it's a termites system where queens are just symbolic, but they don't actually issue orders for workers to do their job or for the soldiers to defend the mounds. And at the end of the day, it works. It works in their thinking. It's sort of like an organized chaos in their own views. So that is also important for us to kind of like pay attention to how these things actually work out. Who do you talk to when there is a violence? And this actually affect how we address human rights issues, like accountability issues. If the center is not in charge, then how do you actually navigate to find someone to hold accountable? Because that's really, and that's why South Sudan issue is very complicated conflicts dynamics to study.
That's really fascinating, and an excellent point about kind of the assumptions that are made from the outside, looking in, and how that can often steer you in the wrong direction in terms of policy proposals at the international level. Speaking of the international level, I want to turn very briefly to the UN mission in South Sudan, which has been significantly affected by the UN's liquidity crisis and kind of the system wide contingency measures within the UN, including troop repatriations and the closure of several bases. And in April of this year, the Security Council narrowed the mission's mandate further to restrict capacity building, development activities, and support for elections. In the current context, what role should UNMISS be playing, and is it adequately equipped to protect civilians amid the risks that are ongoing now?
It's a really very important questions. Their role is still very important in South Sudan because the nation is polarized to an extent that it's a if you ask people who is the president of South Sudan, it really depends on where they are. So the legitimacy is badly contested, and in South Sudan, what is even worse than that, it's actually the sovereignty is badly divided. So it's a so within that context where sovereignty is divided, South Sudan in 2009 had less and less, maybe less than a dozen international security agencies. But as we speak today, it has quadrupled or even higher than that. That you have private securities that had emerged because there is a massive vacuum, and you have proxy militia groups cropping up everywhere that are actually being sort of like, are they part of the states? One night they are, the other night they are not. So this is actually creating a messy situations where you need a neutral force. At least the even if the UNMISS had not been viewed as sort of like overarchingly providing protection to all civilians in areas where there is violence, and that they have a reasons for that, maybe the limitations as to what they could actually do in the past. They are viewed as neutral. At least nobody is seeing them as sort of like as if they are like another aligned with one militia groups or the other. So they are viewed as neutral, and that's really a very important thing. If people are affected, say in Malakal is one vulnerable area, the Malakal town, where there is one of the largest protection of civilian sites, and that area, if it is attacked, and in Malakal the area is contested. Upper Nile, three main groups are the Dinka, the Nuer, and Chuluk. And these groups are basically hostile to one another in a very mutual manner. That today you might see two sort of like as if they are aligned, but then they have underlying issues. So anytime it's very volatile. Any one of them could attack the other two. Um, so that actually requires the UNMISS to be able to provide to protect those people that are in the protection sites in Malakal. And so without forces, they cannot do that. And then at the same time, they could also help in guiding people to safety, providing safe passages and escorting people out. If they cannot protect them inside sort of like a stationary area, they could actually move them. It might be easier for them to like use the movement to encourage people to go somewhere. Those are limited by the fact that there is this contraction of the physical forces and then the resources to be able to do this. So that is a bit unfortunate, given what is happening in South Sudan and what could happen, because that's also potential for more violence, more decentralized violence are there in South Sudan. So the UNMISS is still important, but they could also do more than that. It's when we look at the solutions to South Sudan crisis, yeah, there are regional countries, and then at the higher level there are global partners, EU countries, the Troika, UK, US, and Norway, and then others also globally. So when these groups are actually coming to look for solutions, um, because the UNMISS is inside the country, they could facilitate guiding the parties to go to the table, inter-party dialogues, for example, and the engagements requiring both sides or all sides to come together. UNMISS could facilitate that. And they've done that in 2024 up to 2025, early 2025. They were trying to do these dialogues where they have seen that the agreement was not being implemented, and this was deliberate. It was deliberate lack of political will. The UNMISS was able to guide them. So that actually addressing issues in South Sudan requires broader collaborations in the regions. And UNMISS could also, or the broader UN could also work with the regional blocs, the IGAD and the African Union here. IGAD is sort of like a more localized into the regions organizations, and then you have the African Unions. UN could also come in to kind of like sort of see how to actually combine different tracks for dealing with South Sudan peace. Kenya, for example, had been working on something they call Hope for South Sudan. They call it Tumaini Initiative. It now has stalled. And then the African Union is working with something they call a stabilization mechanism. is led by former Tanzanian President Kikwete. So all those tracks could be actually put together, and UN could also throw its weight behind this in facilitations and actually bringing the actors from the grounds, even transporting them physically, because sometimes the question of trust is an issue. So there are roles the UN could still play in South Sudan. That's what I would say.
Great. And one final question for you, which is given, the ongoing instability and violence in certain parts of South Sudan, given what you said earlier about the kind of future of the peace agreement and upcoming meetings, as well as these processes that are external that seem to stop and start quite a bit. If current trends continue, where do you think South Sudan will be 1 year from now? And is there anything that gives you hope at the current moment?
The thing is, yes, there is. South Sudan is not really heading in the right direction at this point, because the sickness, if we can call it that we have seen in the last 15 years, seems to be deteriorating more. There was a case in the country where the security apparatus was led by someone called Akol Kur for 13 years. And he did a good job in building a very robust institutions around the security. But he made one big mistake of putting himself as the heart of that architecture, and it collapsed when he was removed. So the state in South Sudan, it's built around an individual. And so if this individual exits in a manner that does not involve South Sudanese to have a say in what the future of their country should look like, we could see fragmentations. We could see massive warlords basically claiming areas, because now they will lose the president of South Sudan, or the government of South Sudan was using these militia groups, the warlords, as sort of like a franchise, if you will, where they were actually coming back to Juba to get ammunitions, the guns, the vehicles, the resources, and the money. So if they no longer have that, who would actually step into that vacuum to continue providing this kind of uh, the services to these warlords? So this would create sort of like them creating their own taxes, carving out their own areas. But we are hoping that maybe we don't get there. But that's really the saddest picture that we could see is potential disintegrations. And this would be really sad, where states that are linked to an individuals or even to one party, uh, sort of like they don't survive easily once that party exits naturally. If this, in the case of South Sudan, it looks like it's a state that is actually linked to an individual. So if that person exits, that could become an issue. But then there is also a slow realization, which is a bit positive, where the South Sudanese are realizing, because the outside communities, the regional countries, and even the international community have so many things, competing issues that they are facing. They have massive domestic issues they are dealing with. So they are not coming to tell South Sudanese, look, our hands are full. But they are hoping that the South Sudanese themselves would sort of like start sitting down and realize that they have to have their hands in this thing. That is increasingly what is coming out from outside. And then the inside, there are a few people that are realizing that, oh, maybe we might be on our own. So let's try and do something. So if that is actually something that they will realize, that maybe they are on their own, they are viewed as old enough, because you cannot be really seen as a toddler for 15 years. So that is something that if they all come to realize that they are on their own, and more is expected from them than what they are expecting from outside, that would be a positive thing. And I'm seeing a bit of that kicking in now. It might be a bit late, but that's a positive hope that it's South Sudanese themselves who should actually lead the way in laying down the visions. What is it that they want for their country? Because what has been destroying South Sudan it's the lack is sort of like a lack of political program from both sides of the fighting, the warring parties. The government doesn't really have a clear visions as to what kind of country they are envisioning. And the oppositions are also doing the same thing, which is really the main reasons that the agreements that are signed are imposed on them by the regional countries. And those agreements are never really peace agreements alone. They are comprehensive visions written for these people that are visionless. So it's a bit, and then the South Sudanese themselves, instead of participating in the discourses that are leading to these agreements, they stay away so that they could have a deniability when it comes to the implementations by saying this was imposed on us, we knew was not going to work out. But then when they are asked to actually contribute, that has been missing. And this is really where the grassroots, the South Sudanese, who have been marginalized in all the agreements, could actually come in and say, okay, the agreements were just to stop the guns, to create ceasefires. Now we sit down and design the future of South Sudan. If that happens, South Sudan might surprise people. If they had an election in 2015 without the war, I think it was actually going to be successful elections. But as we speak now, they need to prepare the grounds to unite the people. One other hope is that South Sudan, in the whole continent, the manner in which it was created was actually through a democratic exercise. This was a very unique one. Many countries were created as a result of elites bargaining. But this was the only country where the citizens had to participate in choosing whether to stay in the United Sudan or break away. And 98%, more than 98% of people actually chose to separate. Despite the kind of violence they've been seeing since 1839, South Sudan has been actually subjected to violence throughout. And so for these people to unite, having seen a common cause, something bigger than their differences, this is actually a hope that it could be replicated if they with proper guidance, if they have better leaders, basically directing them to to right choices. They might actually choose something bigger, despite the differences we are seeing and that are pronounced about the issues. They are aware that the elites are the one exploiting these differences. It's not really that the differences are naturally the ones pulling the country aside.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Expert Voices on Atrocity Prevention. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, or Spotify, and we'd be grateful if you left us a review. For more information on the Global Center's work on R2P, mass atrocity prevention, and populations at risk of mass atrocities, visit our website at www.global2p.org and connect with us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or LinkedIn at GCR2P.